Thank you, and my apology for that. So let's start this session because now we are reaching our time. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are. I welcome all of you to join this event at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. This event is hosted by Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs, JIPA. I'm Indu Saxena, the Deputy Director of the Consortium. We at CIPR are really pleased to host this event entitled Power Play in the Indo-Pacific, Great Powers to Small States. For today's discussion, we have a team of experts on international security studies with us. Our esteemed speakers are Professor Dombrowski, Professor Pant, Dr. Anthony Roy Rogers, and MAJ Matthew House. We will be hosting soon the next webinar in this series, so please stay tuned. Moving ahead, first, please allow me to introduce today's esteemed speaker. I will start in alphabetical order. Dr. Anthony Roy Rogers is Senior Lecturer with the Department of Strategic and International Studies, University of Malaya. Served as the head of department from 2012 till September 2020. He has also taught at the Malaysian Armed Forces Staff College, MAFSC, and the Malaysian Defense Armed Force Colleges. He has been invited by the Institute of Diplomatic and Foreign Relations, Malaysia, to lecture at the diplomatic training course for ASEAN attachment officers. He is one of the media resource persons for Radio and Television Malaysia. Sinar Herian and Astro Avani received the Excellent Services Award in 2018 from the University of Malaya. His work has been published in Contemporary Chinese Political Economy and Strategic Relations and International Journal, Malaysian Journal of History, Politics and Strategic Studies, Asian Affairs and American Review, International Journal of Chinese Studies, among others. He is going to speak on when great powers compete over Pakistan, the case of United States and China. Professor Pant is the director and head of the Strategic Studies program at Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defense Studies at King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College, London. He is also a non-resident fellow with Vadhani Chair in U.S.-India Policy Studies at the Center of Strategic and International Studies, Washington, D.C. Professor Pant has been visiting professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, a visiting fellow at the Center of Advanced Studies of India, University of Pennsylvania, a visiting scholar at the Center of International Peace and Security Studies, McGill University, and an Amazing Leaders Fellow at the Australia-India Institute, University of Melbourne. Professor Pant's current research focused on Asian security issues. His most recent books include New Directions in India's Foreign Policy, Theory and Praxis, Cambridge University Press, India's Nuclear Policy, Oxford University Press, The US Pivot and Indian Foreign Policy, Palgrave Macmillan, Handbook of Indian Defense Policy, Rutledge, India's Afghan Model, HarperCollins, and the US-India Nuclear Pact, Policy, Process, and Great Power Politics, Oxford University Press. Professor Pant writes regularly for various Indian and international media outlets, including the Japan Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National UAE, and the Hindustan Times, and the Telegraph. He is going to speak on the emergence of the Indo-Pacific role of middle powers. Dr. Peter Dombrowski is the William Rogers B. Chair of National Security Economics and Professor of Strategy in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the Naval War College. From August 2018 to November 2019, he was the first director of the Admiral James R. Hogue Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute. Previous positions include Chair of the Strategic Research Department, Director of the Naval War College Press, Editor of the Naval War College Review, Co-Editor of International Studies Quarterly, Associate Professor of Political Science at Iowa State University, and Defense Analyst at ANSER Incorporation. He has been affiliated with research institutions including the East-West Center, the Brookings Institution, the Frederick Ebert Foundation, and the Boston Institute of the International Studies at Brown Universities, among others. Dr. Dombrowski's most recent book, co-authored with Professor Simon Reich, is The End of Grand Strategy, Maritime Operations in the 21st Century, Cornell University Press, 2018. His next book, is not the next book, is we already had a book talk on this book. So this is already in the market, and I have read it already. Is with the co-author Professor Wright, Type, Time and Space, American Grand Strategy in Comparative Perspective, Cambridge University Press, 2021. Awards include a Chancellor Scholarship for prospective leaders from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Navy Meritorious Civilian Service Medal, and the Navy Distinguished Civilian Service Medal. He received his BA from Williams College and an MA and PhD from the University of Maryland. He is going to speak on China, India, and the US grand strategies in comparative perspective. Major Matthew House is a foreign area officer in the US Army and currently serves as a security cooperation officer within the Office of Defense Cooperation in the US Embassy in Canberra, Australia. Prior to Australia, Matt served in Vietnam and is fluent in Vietnamese. He holds master's degree in political science and Asian studies from American Military University and Florida State University. There is a lot more to tell about our expert, as this is the shortened version of their bios. So I am so fortunate and greatly humbled to moderate this session with the esteemed speakers. Now, may I invite Dr. Anthony Rogers for his presentation. Please type your questions for the QA session in the chat section. Dr. Rogers, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Indu, for the kind introduction. A very good morning to my colleagues in the United States and also to my colleagues who are in other parts of the world in Asia. Over here in Malaysia, we are already close to 9 p.m. So a very good day to each and every one of you and to my fellow esteemed presenters. So my topic today will be when great powers compete over Pakistan, the case of the United States and China. I must say that this paper or this presentation is an ongoing project between myself and my student on this topic. So let me begin. Pakistan has established diplomatic relations with the United States since its independence in 1947 and with the PRC in 1951. Pakistan has kept close diplomatic relations with both countries. The nature of Pakistan's relations with the US was truly based on economic and military aid that never remained consistent from Cold War and the post-Cold War era, and also until now in the war on terror. However, Islamabad has maintained close ties with Beijing based on decades of behind-the-scenes support in defense and military sphere due to common element of rivalry with India. The relations among China, Pakistan, and the United States are of triangular and complex nature. Pakistan depends heavily on China in its economic and military sphere, while China needs Pakistan for its China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, as a flagship of the Belt and Road Initiative projects. Furthermore, both countries are also interdependent to balance the Indian factor, which is mutual interest and foundation of Pakistan-China strategic friendship. In this connection, the United States also consider Pakistan as its ally in the war on terror and a source for its regional security interests. Historically, the United States has viewed South Asia as an important region, and any expansion of Chinese influence is seen as a potentially problematic to the extent that it presents to somewhat zero-sum terms. However, in recent years, the regional order of Asia-Pacific is under disruption due to the changing dynamics between China and the US. China is trying to reshape the United States regional order through its newly accumulated capabilities to pursue the great power status. In contrast, America is trying to maintain its regional dominance. There was a prevailing notion that Pakistan-China relationship was only because of India, and most literature argues that Pakistan-China relation has nothing in common other than India. However, in the contemporary world, it seems only partly true that yes, India is a factor in the Pakistan-China relationship, but not the factor. The real factor is Pakistan's geostrategic location. China has been self-contained for a very long period in history and now is moving out of its containment. Thus, it is in this context, India has become the secondary factor for China in the era of the 21st century. Its flip side is that it has an element of prosperity and stability that come with China's economic cooperation with Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, was formulated by both countries in mid-2013 and formally announced as a multi-billion US dollar economic and development program on April 20th, 2015. It is a blend of more than 46 billion in investment and loan grants. It includes projects aimed at building energy and communications infrastructure in various parts of Pakistan. On the contrary, the US has had a very measured relationship with Pakistan. It doesn't have considerable investment in Pakistan except economic and military aid for decades. The US has always been blowing hot and cold with Pakistan while seeking for more profound relation with a smaller Afghanistan in the west and much larger India to the east. However, China has provided itself as a strategic alternative to the US for Pakistan. The economic performance has been a key legitimizing force for China. Through CPEC, China would have greater access to Central Asia, the Middle East, and bypassing the Straits of Malacca, China is potentially supplanting and marginalizing the US in Pakistan because Pakistan and China are neighbors, while on the contrary, the US is a few thousand miles away from Pakistan, which is appealing advantage for China over the United States in the long term. In international politics, Pakistan has been aggressively considered as China's potential ally due to its fractured ties with the US in recent years. China has durable economic ties through economic initiatives such as CPEC and the Gouda Economic Free Zone. China's investment in Pakistan has considerable importance as compared to the United States. According to the data provided by the Pakistan Government Board of Investment, foreign direct investment in Pakistan by China grew impressively in recent years. The level of FDI in Pakistan by the US and China from the years of 2009 to 2010 to 2018-2019, FDI by the US in Pakistan was higher than China between the years of 2009 and 10 and 2012-2013. However, there is a considerable drop in US FDI afterwards. The FDI by China, which was lower initial years, reached highest level of 1,311.9 million USD in the year of 2017-2018, including strong ties to China and Pakistan. On the other hand, a significant drop can be seen in the US FDI in recent years of 289.5 million USD, which suggests Pakistan's increasing dependence on Chinese investment in more recent years. In a nutshell, Chinese investment in various sectors under the CPEC are the source of expected socio-economic prosperity that would increase Chinese economic sphere of influence and interdependence. In the realm of economic and military assistance, Pakistan was dependent on the US throughout the years of the Cold War and the War on Terror. Pakistan received billions of dollars in terms of military aid from the US through various programs such as the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, the Coalition Support Fund, CSF, International Military Education and Training Program, IMET, and Foreign Military Financier, FMF. The military aid under the program mentioned earlier were rendered to Pakistan's support and compliance with US requirements in the War on Terror since 2001. Pakistan was the beneficiary of these programs in both terms of George W. Bush during his entire 8 years in office. However, after the announcement of the Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy in March 2009 by the Obama administration, that Pakistan is a safe haven for terrorists and later US unilateral action to kill Osama bin Laden in 2011, both countries have lost asymmetry alliance on the war on terror. These were the starting years of friction in the US-Pakistan relationship that's already never been consistent. The Obama administration withheld funds under 1 billion in coalition support funds and 300 million subject to Pakistan decisive action against various militant groups like the Lakhani Network and the Lashkar-e-Taiba. Furthermore, it is worth noting that in the same way Obama administration, in 2018, the Trump administration also cancelled 300 million military aid of FMF to Islamabad over non-cooperation and perceived failure to take decisive action against militants. Through the FMF grants and IMET, Pakistan was getting US defense equipment and training services, but the Trump administration took military and security aid away to put pressure on Pakistan. In 2018, the US also stopped program under the IMET, where Pakistani army officials were sent to the US military institutions for training that resumed quite recent in last year. Due to the suspension of military and security aid, Pakistan perceived unreliability the United States and was looking for alternative options to mitigate this dependency and tilt towards China to meet its security needs. In the perspective of arms export to Pakistan, China has been filling the gap left by the American military support to Pakistan. It has become the largest seller of arms to Pakistan, and the unstable nature of the relationship and the US strategic shift towards India has remained a risk factor for Pakistan. Pakistan has gradually shifted towards China and enhanced its military cooperation with China to cooperation provides stability in meeting the defense needs of Pakistan. To sum up, Washington has a long history of mistrust, tension, and using Islamabad in its context of its geostrategic ambition and then deserting it to pursue its broader geopolitical agenda in return for better ties with Pakistan's rival India. Instead, China considers Pakistan as a trustworthy ally with a long history of cooperation. Pakistan has signed various agreements with China that envisage that increased Chinese assistance in joint ventures at heavy mechanical complex, Pakistan ordnance factories, and aeronautical complex. Hence, the purchase of military goods, mutual research, manufacturing of arms, and transfer of technology has increased Pakistan's dependence on Beijing and helped China to expand its sphere of influence in Pakistan. However, all this may change in the coming months with the resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan. It is interesting to observe the development in the region, especially how the Taliban would project itself compared to the 1990s, and how also the regional powers such as China, India, Russia, and Central Asian republics would react. Pakistan may receive its prominence again from the US as part of its strategy to balance the influence of the Taliban in the region. Thank you. That is my
Thank you very much, Dr. Rogers, for your nice presentation, unfolded the events for the 21st century's competition, China, Pakistan, America, and India. Now I would like to invite Professor Harshvi Pant for his presentation. He's going to speak on emergence of the Indo-Pacific role of middle powers. Professor Pant, floor is yours.
Thank you, Indu, and thank you for making me part of this very interesting panel. And we have already heard from Dr. Rogers largely subcontinental continental exploration of what is going on, or what have been the equations like. I will largely focus on the maritime domain and the maritime space of what is now called as the Indo-Pacific. And I think what I want to argue is that the logic of middle powers and how middle powers can and should be engaged more in shaping the regional architecture is becoming more and more prominent now, especially in the context of also in the context of Afghanistan as to what has happened. I think the kind of debate and discourse that America's precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan has given rise to. It seems that we are entering into a phase with greater degree of uncertainty about America's intentions and credibility in the region, which it might engender, and therefore making the role of middle powers even more relevant. Geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific has been something that we have been talking about for a while now. People have called it new geopolitics, the new phase in geopolitics. But I think when one is trying to understand this from, say, Indian vantage point, the geopolitics might be new, but I think the idea of the Indo-Pacific is not so new. India, for example, had always viewed the Indian and the Pacific Ocean as one entity, given its own historical linkages, both with its western frontier and eastern frontier. So I think in that sense, from New Delhi's perspective, what is happening is coming back to some of the earlier, more evident rationalities in the process, which somehow was there were these artificial divisions that were imposed after the Second World War. This idea that somehow South Asia and Indian Ocean region are a separate entity, and you have East and Southeast Asia as a separate entity. And I think that what it did was it created this artificial bifurcation in what is Asia Pacific, where the larger balance of power in East and Southeast Asia somehow never included India into the mix. And that, I think, led to a lot of incongruities, both in terms of how the West looked at the East and how India's own foreign policy has evolved over the last few decades. So I think what two factors obviously are important. Indo-Pacific would not have been Indo-Pacific, or the articulation of Indo-Pacific and the acceptance of the logic of Indo-Pacific would not have gained traction if it were not for China's rise, China's dramatic rise, China's expanding profile across the region, across the world, in a way gave this idea coherence, gave this idea sustenance. And on the other hand, you also have India's rise in some ways that added to it. If India had not risen, for example, if India were still the same country or the same economy that it was in 70s and 80s, the articulation of Indo-Pacific would not have been what it is today, because certainly India's role in giving rise to a new architecture in the Indo-Pacific would have been relatively redundant. So I think the fact that the center of gravity of global politics and economics has moved to this part of the world made this idea gain traction, gave this idea more prominence, and I think allowed not only the regional states but also those who are outside to look at the region through a different lens, which was something that was not happening before. So it was not surprising, therefore, if you go back to the legacy issue here, that Japan was the one that that started pushing this idea. Shinzo Abe's famous speech about the confluence of the two seas. This articulation that somehow we need to look at what is happening in the region and look at this entire maritime geography through, as one contiguous geography. And he was, he pushed it at a time in 2000s, in late 2000s, when few were buying into that argument. There was no great receptivity to that argument. But this was this famous speech that he made to Indian Parliament in 2008 that gave sustenance to this, that gave credibility to this argument. That, a reimagining of Asia Pacific geography is possible, and that you have powers like Japan and Australia then and India then invested in looking at the region through a different prism. And I think that that led to this gradual recognition of the Indo-Pacific around the world. Now, what has happened since then? What do we see today? We see today the world largely divided, given the fragmentation in the global order today that we witness from the very top. Again, if you look at the Indo-Pacific discourse debate, you have prominent countries like China, for example, of course, has tried to delegitimize this idea that Indo-Pacific is nothing but it's foam which will dissipate, foam on the edges of the seas, which will dissipate very soon. The sense that this is an idea perhaps that will not gain traction, that is something that is primarily driven by animosity towards China, etc., etc. And I think that's an argument that Beijing has been making for a while and has tried to delegitimize this idea. And you have other countries, for example, like Russians have not bought in, have been very vocal about their dislike for this concept. But I think what is interesting is that there is often this talk of China, which is certainly a very powerful entity. China certainly is driving a lot of national political discourse and operational realities around the world today. But what is also interesting is that despite China's pushback, you have suddenly a great degree of acceptance of the logic of the Indo-Pacific from the West to the East, and also imbibing this idea into respective approaches by various countries. So you are also, whether you're looking at ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific, very difficult decision for ASEAN to make, given how divided ASEAN is. But yet they came out with this, despite knowing that China has pushed back or pushes back against Indo-Pacific. And also on the Western side, in the West, we have seen a great degree of pushback on this question. We have seen countries like Netherlands, Germany, France, of course, UK, all imbibing Indo-Pacific into their strategic calculus. And that, I think, tells you some story, some interesting narrative about what it means for the region, and what it means that despite a powerful entity like China pushing back on this very, very frontally and very powerfully, you do see an acceptance of the logic of Indo-Pacific, perhaps because of this. Perhaps China's behavior contributed to an acceleration of this trend. But what you do see is that this is now something that is widely accepted in a large part of the world. This is not even a matter of contention. So I think the logic of the Indo-Pacific is well accepted. But what it leads to is now the second order problem. Is that once we accept the logic of the Indo-Pacific, once we accept that this is a one maritime contiguous space, what do you then mean when you see that this is a geography which by and large is devoid of any institutional fabric? That you do not have institutions in the region, in this vast geography called the Indo-Pacific, and there are differences among countries as to what how to define the Indo-Pacific. But whatever the definition is, even if you take the basic common denominator of all these definitions, you will see that this is a huge geography, but still devoid of any institutional configurations which can manage some of the challenges that are emerging fast and furious, or that gave rise to this logic in the first place. So I think we have seen this move towards what are now called these ad hoc coalitions, issue-based coalitions, a number of geometries emerging in the Indo-Pacific, various bilaterals, trilaterals, and quadrilateral. The quad being perhaps one of the most talked about. So that also tells you this the sense that countries are looking, or nations in the region are looking to shape the regional security architecture because of the developments happening around the very soon. But still, there is no formality to these arrangements. These are all basically informal arrangements, issue-based coalitions where like-minded countries are coming together on certain issues, trying to make a case to the, to each other and to the rest of the world that this is the best way to preserve some kind of stability in the region. So you have this dawn of minilaterals, a dawn of plurilaterals in the region, and Indo-Pacific has given rise to a number of nomenclature here as well. So I think two issues are important when you're looking at it from the perspective of so-called middle powers, because a lot of this debate actually has been driven by middle powers. Indians, Australians, Japanese have actually contributed much more significantly to this debate than perhaps the major powers, because this is a response to major powers in some ways. So on the one hand, you have the rise of China that has propelled these countries. But on the other, you also have the sense of America, more and more inward-looking, more and more disengaged with the wider world. And we have seen this happening right from the days of Obama administration. Even today, if you look at what is happening in Afghanistan, that gives you a certain sense that there is a domestic constituency in the US, which is growing by the day, which is talking increasingly of a reduced global footprint. And therefore, for countries in the region, they can be allies of the US like Japan and Australia, and they can be partners of the US like India. The question is, something has to be done. You have to think of the region, and you have to think of the consequences of the emergence of this geography without taking into account the US or China. That China is actually generating this momentum, but also American response to this perhaps is also leading the middle powers to push and to take greater responsibility in articulating a framework and pushing for a greater convergence among the like-minded countries. America will, of course, play a role, as we have seen, for example, in the Quad, but increasingly there is a willingness, I think, among the middle powers to shape the regional security architecture. And I think that is an interesting development for a lot of observers, in a sense, given the passivity with which a lot of these countries were taking or responding to the regional challenge. So if you go back all the way to 2007, there's a lot of talk of the Quad. If you go back to 2007, when this idea of Quad started germinating for the first time, Australians and the Indians were the two countries that took one step back and one step forward and two steps backwards. They both rejected the idea at that particular point. Both thought that that this is going to be too explosive. Both thought that this is perhaps going to antagonize China much more. And the idea collapsed at that particular point in time. So it did not move very far. But then from 2007 to 2017, the very fact that the New Delhi and Canberra thought that they can assuage Chinese concerns by not creating a platform like the Quad would give them some benefits when it comes to China, were actually disabused of that notion. So China actually became much more aggressive, and China became much more belligerent towards these countries. And by 2017, Quad had been resurrected. And then we have, from 2017 to 2021, we have seen a very rapid development of the Quad, in the sense that by 2021, you had an administration that came to office in Washington and within months had called the leaders level summit of the Quad. So I think that if you look at the speed and the of change and speed of acceptance of the logic of the Quad, there is also an interesting narrative about how and why Quad seems to be becoming, or seems to be gaining greater traction compared to where it was. And I think, again, here, to a certain extent, the middle powers have been able to push it. So in a sense, the dichotomy, I think, that one faces in the region is that for a lot of these middle powers, America is certainly the most important partner. For the Australians, for the Japanese, and even now for the Indians, given what is happening on the border with China, America is the most important partner. But the idea that American credibility is at stake, how much America can be relied upon, those are the questions that I think there's a lot of debate about that in these countries, a lot of debate about the future of the regional security architecture and what perhaps these countries will have to do on their own without actually taking America into account? I think those are the questions that in some ways are pushing the middle powers into a direction that, in my opinion, is a positive one, because at the end of the day, regional security architecture should be sustained by regional powers. But I think the idea that the US is also facing a test of credibility. You have Kamala Harris visiting Southeast Asian countries this week, very paradoxical again, trying to convince Southeast Asian countries about the reliability of America as a partner. Again, that America is here to stay, that America will push back in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, when there are questions arising about what has happened in Afghanistan. So I think the juxtaposition of these two interesting engagements of the US will cast a long shadow over what happens. But in some ways, what I thought, what I want to articulate or underscore is the sense that increasingly there is space now for middle powers to do more. So analytically, if you think about it, the space for middle powers to do or to push for certain kind of a regional security architecture, to push for like-minded countries to come together has grown, and that space has been activated by these powers. And I think that's perhaps is one of the more interesting stories coming out of the Indo-Pacific amidst all the great power competition and great power engagement that we talk about so often in the Indo-Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pant. Thank you for your presentation. Your presentation unfolded many things: China's dramatic rise to the India's gradual rise, and from the US and reliability in the South Asia to ASEAN countries, for seeing the visit of the Kamala Harris yesterday. So it's an interesting, we will have the questions in QA for this. Now I would like to invite MAJ Matthew House for his presentation. He's going to speak on US-Australia defense partnership and the geopolitical changes in the Indo-Pacific. MAJ House, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Indu. Fantastic work putting this together. And hello to everyone listening in across the globe. As Dr. Indu mentioned, I'm currently located in Canberra, Australia, where the current time is approaching midnight. But I'm very glad to be here and have the opportunity to speak with you all today and share my personal viewpoints with you. I'm here to discuss defense cooperation between the United States and Australia, and try and explain the significance of one of Australia's strategic documents and the effect both have on the Indo-Pacific region. US-Australia defense ties and cooperation are exceptionally strong. The 1951 Australia, New Zealand, United States, or ANZUS treaty serves as the foundation for this military-to-military partnership. In fact, this year marks the 70th anniversary of our treaty alliance formation. However, military historians would know that the military bond between the two nations was forged together in battle during World War I, 103 years ago at the Battle of Hamel on July 4th, 1918, coincidentally America's 142nd birthday, on the outskirts of a small commune of Hamel in northern France, where several American infantry companies fell under the command of Australia's most revered military leader, General John Monash. While the Battle of Hamel is probably one of the lesser known engagements during the Great War, it marked the genesis of Australians and Americans standing shoulder to shoulder in times of conflict. Fast forward from 103 years ago, and through that time, Australia and American forces have shared the trenches and the battlefields during the Pacific theater of World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and 21st century conflicts such as the global war on terror, the Iraq War, and the war in Afghanistan. And it was in July 2020, just last year, where Australia published one of the most consequential defense documents in recent history, when the Australian Defence Force released its Defence Strategic Update. This piece of paper is the guiding strategic defense document for the Australian Defence Force, which in it acknowledges that present times are the most challenging in the geopolitical context since World War II. To put things into context, it was reported that in the financial year 2012 to 2013, the Australian defense budget fell to about 1.56 GDP, the lowest level since 1938. In 2020, last year, despite the global pandemic, defense spending was well beyond 2% GDP and will maintain an above 2% GDP budget for the next decade based off a new 10-year funding model. Some have described these changes as the most significant changes to Australia's strategic posture in a generation. The reason for this is quite clear, in my opinion. The Indo-Pacific theater is the epicenter of rising strategic great power competition. Regional military modernization is occurring at an unprecedented rate. And under the Defense Strategic Update, the Australian Defence Force will prioritize its geographical focus to Australia's immediate region, ranging from the Northeast Indian Ocean through maritime and mainland Southeast Asia to Papua New Guinea and to the Southwest Pacific. The 2020 Defense Strategic Update cautions that Australia must be better prepared for the prospect of high intensity conflict in its immediate region. This is quite notable as before 2020, Australia very much had its defense and security mindset more broadly focused on contributions to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Australia has also served in peacekeeping missions worldwide in every year since 1947, namely in the Middle East, Africa, and parts of the Asia Pacific. So because of this great power competition in the Indo-Pacific, Australia appears squarely focused on its immediate region. Future military capabilities that its defense force will prioritize over the next decade include longer range strike weapons, to include hypersonic weapons, cyber capabilities, and aerial denial systems. Australia's Defence Strategic Update notes that the Australian Defence Force is undertaking the biggest regeneration of its Navy since World War II. The Defence Force is transitioning to a fifth generation Air Force, one of the most modern air forces in the world. In fact, this year, 2021, marks the Royal Australian Air Force's 100th centenary of existence, a feat that outshines even America's mighty Air Force. Greater mobility, protection, and strike power is expected for the Australian Army in the years to come. All told, Australia Defence Strategic Update commits the Australian Defence Force to roughly $200 billion worth of capability investments over the next decade, which is quite substantial. And this goes hand in hand with US and Australia defense cooperation. Our defense ties are as broad as they are comprehensive, and the depth and breadth of the relationship spans across all domains. The challenges of great power competition demands that the US-Australia defense cooperation relationship not be solely defined in terms of military capabilities, but also in terms of capability development, collaboration, and integrated readiness. US-Australia defense cooperation activities in science and technology span cutting-edge technologies, including hypersonics, artificial intelligence and robotics, electronic warfare, and cyber research. Deep ties exist in submarines, shipbuilding expertise, and space-based communications. The US is the partner of choice for Australia's military capabilities, with the goal to be as interoperable with US forces as possible, which is a testament to Australia being one of America's most trusted allies in the region, if not the world. Australia became the world's second largest weapons importer in 2018. It was the second largest arms export destination for US arms exports in 2019. Australia has traditionally been one of the world's largest importers of American armaments. Recent key purchases include 72 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, 12 EA-18 Growler airborne electronic attack aircraft, and 15 P-8 Poseidon maritime surveillance and patrol aircraft. Other notable examples of Australia acquiring US systems include the F-18 Super Hornet, the C-17 Globemaster, the MQ-4 Triton, the M1A1 Abrams main battle tank, CH-47 Chinook heavy lift helicopter, and Aegis combat systems for surface ships. Australia has also publicly stated its intent to procure the US Army's Apache attack helicopter, the latest version of the Abrams main battle tank, and Under Armour combat engineering vehicles, such as the assault breacher vehicle and the joint assault bridging system. Australian military forces have enjoyed a high level of interoperability with US forces. Today, as the global strategic and economic center of gravity shifts, well, it's already shifted in my opinion, to the Indo-Pacific region, our two nations continue to strengthen our commitment to one another. We engage in complex, combined warfighter training together in a number of bilateral and multilateral defense exercises, including exercise Talisman Saber, which is conducted in Australia. The 2019 iteration of Talisman Saber involved over 33,000 Australian and US military personnel. Such exercises enable improved effectiveness of jointly operating military forces. And exercise Talisman Saber 2021 recently concluded last month. And while the total exercise force was significantly pared down compared to the 2019 iteration, overwhelmingly due to the ongoing global pandemic, the most recent iteration saw capabilities be brought into Australia for the first time. Notably, the US Army's Patriot missile defense system participated in the exercise and conducted its first ever firing on Australia's soil, but it was also, to my knowledge, the first ever firing of a Patriot system in the entire Southern Hemisphere. So quite substantial. All of this leads to a stronger, more capable Australia, which shares values and strategic interests with the United States 103 years on. So in closing, it's certainly an exciting time to be a security cooperation officer in Australia. It's never a dull moment for me. The bond shared between Australia and the United States is unbreakable, in my opinion, transcending formal military alliances. And as for the alliance, it is unshakable and arguably at its strongest ever point in its relationship. I'm looking forward to seeing how we will enhance our mutual defense ties further, deepening our bilateral relationships and our shared interests in multilateral fora, such as bolstering the Australia, India, Japan, and United States Quad dialogues, as mentioned previously. The aperture to strengthen our defense ties is ever expanding, and especially so during this present time of great power competition. The Indo-Pacific continues to be the US Department of Defense's priority theater, And in the latest interim national security strategy guidance from President Biden, he lists China as the pacing threat. So with the priority theater, the Indo-Pacific, that means strengthening our relationships with allies and partners in the region. And that is one of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command's focus areas. And specifically, our relationship with Australia is vital now more than ever. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Major House, for the wonderful presentation. And I'm glad to share that our team has written a article on the GPA issue, and that fall issue has come out today only. And I'm very thankful to the top US defense official at Canberra, Michael Tomsick, who edited our paper on Australia and China Cold War. And I can remind that all from the ANZUS Treaty from 1951 to today's US-Australia Defense Cooperation, and how it's evolving, and what is China's take on this, and how its relevance in Indo-Pacific. Thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Professor Dombrowski for his presentation. And he's going to speak on China, India, and the US grand strategies in comparative perspective. Professor Dombrowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Indu, for the kind introduction, and it's great to join this panel and this event. I'm going to a very rare thing for me. I'm actually going to use PowerPoint. I can't believe I'm on a panel with nobody else using PowerPoint, but I will this time. And so just bear with me 1 second while I pull it up. So I have a host disabled participant screen sharing. Is there any way you can fix that? If you can, I can not share the PowerPoint.
Okay, let me try. Professor Dombrowski, can you open your PowerPoint on your screen?
I certainly, I can't, it's open on my screen, but
okay.
It's disabled for screen sharing. If you can, I can just speak. It's not a big deal.
Indu, it's the green button down at the bottom.
I think it's good now.
It's good. Thank you. Thank you, Doc.
Just give me a second and I will get it up.
Sure.
The screen. Okay. So while I'm fiddling trying to figure out how to share this, let me just say a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to talk at a level of generality that's above the previous panelists, in part because you all are much greater experts in the region than I am. I'm sort of a grand strategy person, military strategy person who does not specialize in the Indo-Pacific region. Although, as I think you will see, I spend a fair amount of time thinking about the region because I indeed work for the US Navy, and the US Navy, of course, is quite interested in the region. So I do spend a fair amount of time thinking about it. I am having a terrible time getting this to come up. There we go. Give me 1 second. Okay. So can we all see it now?
Yes, Professor, we can see it.
Okay, great. So the title is, as Indu mentioned, the title of my talk is China, India, and the US Grand Strategies in Comparative Perspective. Before I actually begin, I should note that I am a US government employee, and it's important that I give my disclaimer. The views presented here do not reflect the official positions of the United States government, the United States Navy, or any other department or agency. I just saw a typo, that's lovely. So my speaking is in an official, unofficial capacity as a professor, not as a government official. Today's presentation, I'm gonna do a little bit of an introduction, then I'm gonna very briefly talk about what is grand strategy and what is strategic planning. And then I'm gonna talk about some comparisons and how we think about great power conflict, both in terms of the individual countries involved and in terms of how you understand these great powers in relationship to one another. So by way of introduction, and I'll just stay on this slide, my engagement with the grand strategy of the region began prior to the Asia Pacific, the America's Asian pivot. We, at the War College, we did a series of workshops and white papers looking at different strategic alternatives for the region in terms of US strategy and policy. So we looked at everything from maintaining a position of primacy to a more isolationist approach, which withdrew the United States in large part from the region. The policy work we did was then published with revisions as a book with Georgetown University Press that some of you may have seen, and I'll give the site later. Subsequently, continued the engagement from the perspective of US grand strategy in a series of works with my colleague Simon Reich, who I think is in the audience, and Thierry Balzac, who's at Sciences Po in France. So today's presentation, the remainder of the presentation, will be based on policy work I did as part of the Naval War College and academic work I did in collaboration with Dr. Reich and Dr. Balzac. So without further ado, let me just do a brief foray into grand strategy. I'm not going to read this. All of you are very familiar with it, but let me just point out a couple of things in some of the classic definitions. And I'm going to use this as a way of thinking through the three grand strategies of the great powers in question. So this is Dr. Stephen Krasner's definition. He was a member of the policy planning staff at State Department at one point. He's a famous academic. And if you'll see the yellow highlight, this is a particularly American worldview. A grand strategy describes how the world is and envisions how it ought to be. In fact, so it has a world-shaping dimension. But this is a definition of grand strategy that isn't particularly useful for many countries that don't have the possibility of envisioning how the world might be. In fact, they have to take that which is given to them in global security, political, and economic environments. The next definition is the classic, I skipped through one, is the classic War College definition. If any of you have gone to War Colleges, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, there's a whole discussion of ends, ways, and means, national objectives, the ways we accomplish those objectives, and the means we have to do those objectives. This is sort of the classic approach to grand strategy. I think it's fair to say, in the work I've done with Dr. Reich and Dr. Balzac, that we take exception to some of this, these standard definitions in a whole series of ways. And I'll get to that in the coming slides. But the American and Anglo-American school of grand strategy, as Ionescu, as Dr. Popescu has said, is sort of the standard approach to grand strategy that we, in fact, not rail against, but we take exception to. So grand strategy beliefs include grand strategies equated with a rational policy process, whether this is the UK, Germany, Russia, China, India, or the smaller countries around the world, Australia, Australia, Malaysia, or Pakistan. Grand strategy is rationalistic. Strategic planning focuses on risks and threats to the nation. Strategies succeed or fail based on the strengths and weaknesses of planning and implementation, a rational sort of reconciliation of ends, ways, and means. Generally, the folks that identify with the grand strategy field believe that only great powers have grand strategies. And they also minimize the significance of domestic politics. and I'm going to speak for myself here because I'm not sure my co-authors would stand it. This standard view is wrong in many dimensions. Grand strategies exist even if they are not public or articulated. They are in effect revealed preferences of the states at hand. So the United States, and to some extent in China, there are public policy documents that are issued on strategic ends, national, whether it's the ministries of defense or the State Department or the White House. There are sort of big public policy documents that stake out the positions of countries. But not all countries do this. But that doesn't mean these countries that don't issue documents don't have grand strategies. It's something as scholars and analysts, we have to search through behaviors, policy statements, and budget documents, for example, to think about what the strategies actually are. Furthermore, grand strategy is not solely the province of great powers. Barry Posen's definition relies on a clause of grand strategy, says it's a nation's efforts to cause security for itself. All countries, whether they're great or small or middle powers, want to cause security for themselves. They use the planning process to think about the ways to protect themselves from threats, to achieve more positive ends. And they do this regardless of what the size of the power is, how they fit in within the larger global scheme. We believe that grand strategies secure the full range of national interests and not solely military security. Many Anglo-American writings on grand strategy truly focus on the military dimension for lots of reasons you can find in our work. We think that economic security, diplomatic security, political security, and security from a range of environmental and natural threats are equally important to military strategy. Furthermore, grand strategies are not only for wartime conflicts and crises. Grand strategies take place, in fact, the heart of grand strategies lie in peacetime, when most countries seek to avoid war and conflict. They seek deterrence or reassurance, alliances, and they try to avoid war. Now, obviously, the exceptions to this in some ways prove the rule. Hitler's Germany and countries that have actually actively sought war as a national policy don't fall within this category. But certainly during peacetime, it was clear what Nazi Germany's ambitions were in terms of wartime. Understanding a state's domestic politics is essential to understanding a state's grand strategy. And this is a backwards attack on sort of realist thinking in international relations that looks at international structures as a driver, where you sit within the global interstate system, what the level of hierarchy is within that system, and generally has a competitive approach to how great powers position themselves within the position. We actually think you need to look more closely at domestic politics. I'm going to skip this slides and move on because I think there's more to say and I don't want to take up too much time. The next point I want to make, and this ties to the actual topic of the talk, is that comparison is essential. One size of thinking about grand strategy, whether it's the Anglo-American or American approach or others, does not fit all states. We need to actually study the individual states within a region, the Indo-Pacific, or at a global level. There's a market for and a need for, both in the scholarly world, but also in the policy world, for deep understanding of individual grand strategies. Dr. Reich and Dr. Thierry Balzac and I have a series with Oxford University Press where we are commissioning works on individual countries and their grand strategies in an effort to instantiate that claim. That we are trying to encourage scholars to look deeply at the individual strategies, not just of great powers, but of powers like Singapore and Japan and others. We believe that comparison should be based on history, tradition, strategic culture, the legal systems of the country in questions, and the institutions. Just as a simplistic example, many great powers have gigantic bureaucracies charged with foreign relations or defense or national security, but many countries don't have this. They don't have the large scale intelligence communities that you see in the United States or China or India. And this is important if you're going to think clearly about Australian or Singaporean or Malaysian grand strategy. You need to take into account the nature of their own institutions. The institutions in the West aren't necessarily the institutions of the individual countries that we want to think about grand strategy and how they intersect at a regional basis. So a country like Saudi Arabia, for example, simply doesn't have the same institutional and political dynamics that you do in the Western countries. And it's important to understand that if you're going to understand their needs and desires and ways of causing security for themselves. Finally, comparisons are not just about individual states in a snapshot of time. August 25th, 2021. Comparison needs to be done across the type of grand strategies that are alternative for countries, the time frame you're talking about. Grand strategies evolve over time, and that's one of the really important things in the Indo-Pacific region. And I'll talk about that in a second. And you also need to talk about place, the spatial relations and spatial dynamics. There are different strategies, take China, for example, for the South China Sea and how it behaves and acts and what its security interests are than there is in the Western Indian Ocean or the Mediterranean. They all may be subsumed upon China's naval modernization and perhaps its desire to have a blue water navy. But the way these policies and strategies are executed varies greatly depending on the geography and the space and the relationship to the center of the actual national home. Let me just circle back to time. I mean, one of the interesting things about, and again, I'm talking at a much higher level of generality than our previous speakers. Let's take the issue of time and how the three big countries that I identified in my presentation have behaved within this new region we call Indo-Pacific. I think it's fair to say, at the risk of overgeneralization, that in the early years of India's independence, it pursued a non-aligned policy. It did not take part in the Cold War in those early years as a member of either the Soviet bloc or the Western American bloc. It pursued a non-aligned policy and tried to get other countries as part of the non-aligned movement and the Bandung Conference and things like that to pursue a more independent course that was based on anti-imperialism and efforts to resist the global system as it had been constituted by powers before World War II. Over time, India's strategy has become more open to the outside world. It still takes an independent course, but has certainly not cut itself off from the world, and particularly when it's in no own neighborhood in the Indian Ocean, and when it's looked in East policy in regard to China, has had a more engaged policy, and in some ways, and we can talk about this in the Q&As, has actually found an accommodation with the United States in many dimensions. Not a formal alliance, but a partnership which we can envision in things like the Malabar exercises, nuclear weapons nuclear weapons agreements, and things like that. China. In many ways, and I don't want to aggravate the audience, but in many ways, India in the last 20 years has been the strategic driver of the region, both for India, the United States, but also for many of the smaller countries in the region. China's dynamism, its economic growth, and its military and naval rise, and its more willing efforts to use its power to shape its environment, somewhat like the United States tries to shape its environment, is probably the single driving force in the grand strategies of external powers, extra-regional powers, but also for the smaller countries in the region. And I think that's a fact. It's not an interpretation. Much of what we talk about when we talk about grand strategies in the region involves responding to, reacting to, or resisting China. Whether China needs to be resisted is a separate question, but certainly the threat posed by potential Chinese aggression, by Chinese efforts to shape the economies through the BRI project or through the string of pearls or these kind of large scale efforts is a dominant force in how we think about this. Sorry, I have a if you can hear that, it's a Zoom vacuum in the background. The next thing I want to say, which is the newest part of the thinking in Reich and Balzac and myself, involves relational thinking. It's not just sufficient to simply think deeply about individual countries' grand strategies. It's also important to think about them in relationship to one another. It's important to think about them, how one grand strategies affect the other. So take the example of China's rise in military modernization and newly aggressive approach to international organizations, to regional issues, fisheries management, things like that. Is it actually shaping how other countries' grand strategies are executed? The Asia pivot, for example, on the American part, wasn't just a case of the American political and strategic leadership waking up one day and saying, oh, let's make the Asia Pacific the focus, or the Indo-Pacific the focus of a shift in US national security thinking. If you remember the time of the pivot, we were still mired, and we still are, in Iraq and Afghanistan. And thinking about the greater Middle East as one of the primary threats to American security. But as those conflicts wound down, or at least the American involvement began to wound down, the rise of China, its tremendous growth of its Navy, its tremendous nuclear modernization program has become increasingly clear in the last few years, caught the attention of the American national security. And the American traditional role as a maybe offshore balance or outside extra regional power in the region, Vietnam and these other conflicts, was called into question. And America decided to pivot to the region. Now, how we think about the pivot, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, whether it's actually been implemented in a way that's as influential as it might have been, is a separate question. But it's important to think that this is a relational question. The United States wasn't doing this on its own. It was responding to events. It was particularly responding to China, and it was responding to China's influence on the economic dynamism of the region and the changing security architecture. In a similar fashion, the rapprochement with India, this burgeoning relationship, this partnership, with all its ups and downs, with all its complexity, in part is a change in India's grand strategy and a change in America's approach in seeking partners to counteract China's growing role in the region. So I think, I don't want to say too much more. I've probably talked for too long. I wasn't actually timing myself. My belief, and I'll say just for myself, is to think deeply about the region. It's important to study individual points of time, but we need to study over time. It's important to study individual countries, but we need to study comparatively. It's important to study comparatively, but then we need to take the next step. If we want to get an overarching picture of the Indo-Pacific, we need to think how these grand strategies, not just the great powers, or that might focus here, but also have many of the middle powers and small powers in the region, what some people have called pivotal states like Singapore, how they interact and mix together over time so that we can get a wider sense of both the regional security in the Indo-Pacific and the global security environment as a whole. This is just a small advertisement for our work. what I've said today is largely an amalgamation of many points made in a set of books over time. I mentioned the Indian Ocean and US Grand Strategy book. The End of Grand Strategy book done with Simon has several chapters that deal specifically with the Indo-Pacific region. Our Comparative Grand Strategy book has chapters on India and China, and the Cambridge Elements book across time, type, and space. Section 4 of the very short volume tries to apply some of the principles I've talked about over the last few minutes to the Indo-Pacific, that tries to do some of this relational and comparative study with the three great powers I talked about. I encourage you to take a look at that for a more in-depth view. With that over, and I'm open to questions or discussion, I'd love to get into some of the credibility questions raised by Dr. Pant and the others, and all the detailed issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dombrowski. Very wonderful presentation, starting from the definition of the grand strategy and how it's evolving, like it's for the small states, so the middle powers, and it's what are the relevance for the Indo-Pacific for all these middle powers and small states grand strategies. So please type your questions in the QA section. And I would start with you, Professor Dombrowski. My question is, in your analysis, what is perceived as a greater concern in Biden's grand strategy, Greater Russia or China's dream of national rejuvenation?
Well, that's a good question. And I don't think you can separate the two out. I think the fundamentals are the wider scope of Asia, because it is about economic, economic vitality and growth and innovation. It is about the role they play in the international trade and financial system as a whole, not just China. So I think, underlying this is this fundamental shift in the global geopolitics. I think it was Dr. Pant that mentioned that. The other thing I'd say is there are other crisis points aside relationship with China for the United States. Nobody wants to see any escalation of the situation between China and India, or between Pakistan and India, much less conflict on the Korean Peninsula. And these are great concerns for American policymakers. But, and this is the big but, and I'll stop. In terms of America's global interests, there really is only one challenger. Russia is important, but it has modest political and economic capabilities. China, if you think in power transition terms or the big picture of hierarchies within the global system, China is the real deal, and China will remain for years to come a focus of American policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dombrowski. So my question is to Dr. Rogers. How do you see Pakistan in US foreign policy after the US exit from Afghanistan? How would Pakistan quantify benefits like aid, resources, and weapons as being a US ally compared to a new evolving Pak-China alliance?
Yes. You see, as I was mentioning earlier on, my concern is, you see, I would put, the three countries, in a line. On one end is Beijing or China, and the other end is Washington and the United States, and Pakistan, say, in the center. But what happens, or what appears now, is Pakistan is tilting towards China. And that is I would say the concern is, before it goes to a point of no return, I think now it's a time that US or the policymakers under the Biden administration to try and pull Pakistan back, at least to the center. If it's not back to the sphere of Washington, at least to the center, rather than it further drift towards China, as what happens to Cambodia or Djibouti that is, and things like this. So my concern now is how to pull Pakistan back at least to the center and not being too pro-China on one hand, right? And with this, the latest development of Afghanistan, the rise of Taliban, I would say again there will be a power play among the major powers in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. I think obviously China will have some interest in Afghanistan, connecting China from the province of Xinjiang into Iran via Afghanistan, trying to have some form of cooperation with the Taliban. So here again, there will be a power play of major powers in Afghanistan, or what they call the Great Game that is happening in Central Asia. So it's interesting to see, as I mentioned in my presentation, in the recent months or to come, or in few months to come, how the development in Afghanistan will take place. But definitely, I would say US will have to somehow regain Pakistan's confidence so that it pull it back to the center. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. My next question is to Professor Pant. Professor Pant, what are the risks and opportunities for India post the US exit in Afghanistan? Can India share a comfort zone with Russia and Afghanistan, knowing the China-Pakistan influence in the region? Can Russia tout these geopolitical changes in Indo-Pacific? I have multiple questions in one question. Can I repeat it, or are you able to?
No, I'll address them. I'll address it slightly, coming from a different vantage point. As Professor Dombrowski talked about what is happening in terms of foreign policy or grand strategy is never a one-way street. Countries think that they have a foreign policy, but foreign policy is also done to them. So how others react to what you are doing is also, it creates this loop. So in a sense, what has happened, I think, in the Indian context is that China has become such an important variable. A year and a half back, there was still perhaps a sense in New Delhi that China can be managed. That you continue to have a relationship with China, which is about trying to resolve long-standing disputes over a period of time, and somehow eventually this will yield certain results. And so long as India is not completely seen as being on the Western side of the equation, then perhaps Chinese will be a little more benevolent to India. But what has happened is, in the last year and a half, all the assumptions now have been cast aside, and a lot of remapping of Indian positions is happening. So I think in that context, a lot of the questions, for example, become clearer. The whole logic of Quad, for example, the logic of its partnership with the US, even as US-India relationship has developed over the last few decades, there has always been this persistent question about how far can India go with the US, whether India should be signing foundational agreements with the US, whether India can ever be an alliance partner of the US. And I think if you look at the record today, it's much clearer. There is a sense that India needs to work together with the US on multiple fronts, and especially on defense and strategic positioning. And a range of issues are now being rectified. So, if you look at, the whole non-alignment has been turned on its head. Indian foreign policy makers today openly in public platforms say that we are no longer non-aligned. We are willing to align with countries based on issues. So I think there is a change both in terms of discourse and both in terms of, and as well as in terms of operational realities on the ground. Now, and in this comes, Russia. And India, given that India has had a traditionally very substantive engagement with Russia throughout its historical record of the last 6-7 decades, there is a comfort level with Russia, at least at the elite level. Russia has had in the past given India technologies that no other country was willing to give to India, nuclear submarines, aircraft carrier technology, etc. So there is, there is a historical legacy with Russia that is important, and India often sees its engagement with Russia in those terms, that it is important to keep those channels of communication open, because Russia is a very, very important partner, has been a very, very important partner. The problem for India is that Russia's position on foreign policy today, on most foreign policy issues today, is being shaped by its largely adversarial relationship with the West. And so India, India becomes, its ties with India have also become a casualty. So we have, in India, there is a sense that increasingly Russia is speaking the language that the Chinese want Russia to speak. Whether it is very, very strong resistance to the Indo-Pacific, whether it is about opening up to Pakistan, whether it is about Quad, whether it is about also to a certain extent what is happening in Afghanistan. Russia is one of the few countries that has changed. That in the past, in the 1990s, if you go back to the 1990s, India, Iran, and Russia worked together to sustain Northern Alliance, which was a main resistance to the Taliban. Today, that coalition has been fractured. Russians are willing to engage with the Taliban, and Indians are more reluctant. And you see the larger fragmentation of the global order. You do see the West taking a consolidated position. There are suggestions that the West will have to coordinate its actions and work together on Afghanistan, whereas the Russians and the Chinese and the Pakistanis and the Turks have already, these countries are already there in Afghanistan. They have embassies there, open embassies. Their embassies are open. So I think what we are looking at is India is responding to, in some ways, to this fragmentation also. And so I think Afghanistan and the issue of Russia has also become a casualty to that larger process, which is which is unfolding in the wider international system. And that, I think, will be a tricky thing for India to balance. India wants to balance its ties with Russia and its ties with the US, but increasingly, I think there are pressures that might become unsustainable beyond a certain point.
Thank you, Professor Pant. I have another question from the chat box, from the chat section. Like it says, someone Petro Farkas to everyone. What role do you see for Europe in balance of power in the region? Anyone, please, Professor, can go for this question because.
I can speak if nobody else wants to.
Sure.
So, I don't want to offend my European friends because I'm a Europeanist by training and background. I spent much of my career dealing with European security issues. But I think we need to be clear that the European military role is fairly limited. Right? It's just, despite the very high-profile deployments of the British carrier and France's longstanding role in the region because of its overseas possession, most European powers simply don't have the resources and the capabilities to play a substantial role. Now, that's not to say they don't have an important diplomatic role, an important political role. And certainly in economic terms, Europe's relationship with the region are very important. So I don't want to underestimate that, but I think that the particularly security issues are more symbolic than definitive. And, if I was going to put my hat on and be controversial, I would hope that the Europeans would spend more time worrying about Russia in their own area of operations than the Asia Pacific. I love them dearly, but the implicit division of labor. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. My next question from the chat section is from Dr. Achla Gunasekara Rockwell. How will the fallout from the US withdrawal from Afghanistan impact US efforts to win over Indo-Pacific states that are sitting on the fence of great power competition, that is Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, or the Pacific Island states? Does this seemingly badly damage the US brand in Washington's effort to counter Chinese diplomacy in the region? Anyone, please?
Yeah, I thought, my own sense is that certainly in the short term, it will raise some questions because, and even, even in a country like India that is largely at this point, largely pro US, and there is a great degree of sympathy for the US in terms of the larger strategic competition with China. But so even there, one can see the debate it has spawned. That the Afghanistan withdrawal has spawned, and I think to many this is, the American withdrawal was happening. Everyone knew it. We have been talking about this since the days of Obama, but I think this raises some questions about the sheer competence of handling this kind of a situation. It's not. I don't think the long-term consequences are going to be that severe. I think in the short to medium term, certainly there are questions, and for a lot of countries in the region where China has been able to argue its case very well, saying that look, we are a good model to follow. Certainly, this sense that this withdrawal process has been quite shambolic in some ways, that will raise some concerns. I do not see a long-term consequence of this in the Indo-Pacific. I think it will shape up according to its own requirements. Countries will respond according to what America does over the next few years in the region, or does not do in the next few years, whether America is able to emerge as a credible economic partner, because I think that has been a big issue in the Indo-Pacific, that America's emergence as a strategic partner is well taken, but I think there is a withdrawal from the larger economic dynamic where China has been filling the shoes or filling that space. So I think those questions will matter more over the long term than what has happened in Afghanistan. But certainly in the short to medium term, it does raise questions more than American credibility. I think there are issues around that as well. But I think also on I think it showed a very side of America that I think people are not used to. There's a sense that Americans, are quite capable of handling crises, and this management was largely shambolic, and I think that raises some concerns, and that has raised a lot of concerns, including in a country like India, which, as I said, remains largely positive about America's role in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to invite Professor Dombrowski. I can see the hand raised on your screen if you want to say something on this, please.
Yes, I largely concur with Professor Pant's analysis of short-term versus long-term. And since I'm thinking about grand strategy, really the long-term is what counts. So, the immediate reaction to the shambolic efforts to, end the evacuate personnel is certainly there. But I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay, Professor. Please go ahead.
I do want to say a couple things that are, a little discordant in some ways. So countries in the region has to ask themselves a question, which is, if you need an external security partner, which other countries would be more reliable and more competent as a partner than the United States? If you see another country that could be a reliable partner and shares your interest, that's one thing. I would suggest that there's good reason to think there aren't many other partners available with the sort of, strength and global reach that the United States has. And then the second thing is, and I'll shut up after this, is the United States, for right or wrong, poorly or strongly, has spent 20 years in Afghanistan. Depending on how you count, there was 8 years in Vietnam. America's will and commitment and the costs, both in terms of American lives and American treasure, is quite high. I think you'd be hard pressed to find many other countries in modern times that have taken such extensive efforts. Now, I'm not saying these are good things. I think there's a lot of questions there, but on the credibility, commitment, and competency thing, the question is compared to what, compared to whom? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Rogers, please.
Yeah, I would share the same opinion as the other two colleagues. I think in short term, they may have some form of a dent to America's credibility in the region, but in the long term, it's undeniable as the US is seen as one of the balancer towards the China. Take for instance in the South China Sea, where Malaysia is one of the claimants. So no doubt that there is close relations between Malaysia and China, but at the same time, the US is seen as a balancer towards Chinese hegemony in South China Sea. And this issue of the withdrawal of US from a former country that it used to support is not new actually. As the professor mentioned, in Vietnam, right way back in the 70s, after the withdrawal of the US from South Vietnam, eventually the collapse of South Vietnam, yet the US is still being welcomed in parts of the world as a kind of a guarantee or a guarantor for security in long term. So I think, yes, in short term, that it may have a kind of a dent but in long term, it will maintain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rogers. My question is to Major House. Like we know that since the UNCLOS Treaty, US and Australia, they have been the partner in defense cooperation. But now, like if compare and contrast, if I do it from the President Trump to President Biden, and it's more a kind of strengthening relationship, how do you see that it's in the emerging Indo-Pacific construct, and how would you say something about it from the Chinese perspective, that is they are saying that US and Australia defense partnership is kind of a sort of a coalition against China's rise or in the power competition in Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, so my opinion is to the latter question is absolutely. US and Australia and other allies and partners of the US are certainly going to look at the US is certainly going to look at a coalition approach moving. There won't be any unilateral action, in my opinion, with China. It has to be, if it comes to a high intensity conflict, it has to be with the coalition of partners and allies. And Australia is key for mutual benefit both ways. Much like Japan is, much like potentially the Pacific Islands are. So Guam, very significant. But to your earlier question, maybe you can repeat it, because I kind of.
Yeah, sure. My question is that, like, from if you compare and contrast from the President Trump to President Biden.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So what do you say on that?
Well, I can't say much because I'm it's the commander in chief, but I will say that I think both presidents had a very clear strategic policy and framework towards the Indo-Pacific, and it really started with President Trump, with some of it not so good, in my opinion, some of it very good. The ripping up of TPP probably wasn't hindsight the best thing to do, but other aspects other initiatives that he had worked towards are, in my opinion, commendable. But Biden, he's just getting on board, not even a year in the job, but based on the interim national security strategy guidance, based on Vice President Harris's visit in region right now, and based on the Quad and how we're focusing on really vaccine diplomacy and the quadrilateral, all of that only bodes well for the perception of the U.S. in the region. So.
Thank you, Major House, for your answer. And now it's the time for a wrap up, because I know it's very late in Canberra, and my apology for that, and India, and Dr. Rogers in Malaya, in Kuala Lumpur too. So for the thanks from our operation team who helped us in making this event happen. And thank you all our attendees for joining us today. I would like to special thanks to Professor Simon Reich. He's my professor, awesome professor, I would say. On behalf of the consortium and the director of the consortium, Dr. Ernest Gunasekara Rockwell, I thank you all experts and speakers. Thank you, Professor Dombrowski. Thank you, Professor Pant. Thank you, Professor Rogers. And thank you, Major House, all attendees for your valuable times. Please stay tuned for our next book titled America and the Indo-Pacific, Trump and Beyond, co-authored by Professor Harshvi Pant and Mr. Kashish Paripyani in late September. And next, we are coming up in the next webinar series in late October. Please stay tuned. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Indu. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe. Bye-bye.